Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. We're talking about the police today, and as libertarians, we have plenty to say about the police. What should the system look like, and what are some of the problems with the monopoly government provision of policing services? We would need police services one way or another, but what would they look like if they were not provided by a coercive monopoly? That's the kind of question I want to run by our guest today, and that's Tate Fegley, who is a 2018 Mises Institute Fellow. He won the Grant Aldrich Graduate Student Essay Prize at the Austrian Economics Research Conference, and he's currently a PhD student in economics at George Mason University. Tate, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
What might policing look like in a free society?
I think one thing that might be underemphasized by those speculating on what a private system of policing looks like is how much it's bundled with other services. So, as many point out about Disney World or the mall, policing services tend to be provided as a package with these other things. And I think there's too much focus on this model that we have of city police departments instead being provided by a private provider.
I think, by the way, that's how a lot of public goods problems would be resolved in a free society, is that you would bundle them all together. And how would private policing help in this situation where you have many black people who feel like the police are hostile to them, and they can point to some cases that clearly are pretty gruesome looking to the average observer? How does that get changed under a private system, and why?
Well, I think the most obvious difference is that private police would have to be voluntarily paid by their customers, which is something that's not the case for government police. If we compare the response of Starbucks when it faces this public backlash after its use of the police to arrest two African-American men who had been at the Starbucks without purchasing anything, were asked to leave and refused to do so. Critics say this was probably racially motivated due to the fact that this is a common thing of people sitting within a Starbucks and just enjoying the atmosphere without purchasing anything. And so you can bet that Starbucks will be very careful in terms of its corporate policy, in terms of how it will use the police in the future regarding these types of things, where it's unclear that the Philadelphia police who actually perform the arrest will face any type of cost from this. Obviously, the biggest difference is in terms of the profit motive that private individuals face in having to continually garner the interest of voluntarily paying customers, unlike government police.
I think sometimes we assume that in order for there to be private police, we'd have to already have reached anarcho-capitalism. We'd have to already have smashed the state's monopoly on the use of force. But you point out in one of your articles that this is actually not right, that we could even imagine, even with the state maintaining that monopoly, that you could still have a diverse array of services for policing. And that, I think, is what's hard for people to envision. So what exactly would that look like? I mean, of course, we have it now, as you say, with Disney World, but how could that work in my neighborhood?
One example, I know you had Dale Brown of Threat Management Center previously on your show.
Yeah.
And one of the services he provides, in addition to his corporate clients, is to neighborhoods. And I believe they contract through some type of homeowners association to provide these types of services. And so, I don't think this would be much of a problem for you as a homeowner obtaining these services on the market.
The thing is, there are things I don't want government doing, but that I do want to have done. It's not so much that I want a private company to come in and nab the criminal once he's in my house, although that would be nice. It's more that I don't want him getting in my house in the first place. And I think with a private company, given that I can switch to another company anytime I want to, anytime I find that that company is engaged in practices that I don't like, or they're too intrusive, or they're skulking around my house too much, I can just get rid of them and get a new one, whereas I couldn't do that with the government police because there's no choice with the government police. So in other words, there are things that I'm okay with a private company doing because I maintain the ability to choose to go in a different direction at some point. So the trouble seems to me is that a private company could do more to prevent crime because I wouldn't really mind if the private company is kind of looking around, if I give them permission to look around on my property and stuff. But practices that I could accept with a private company would be viewed as civil liberties violations if carried out by the police.
I think you make a really good point here. It's reminiscent of Robert Higgs and his ratchet effect regarding how when government grows, it's very hard to shrink it back to where it was previously. And so once you allow government these ability to intrude on your private space, it's really difficult to get them back out of it. Whereas, as you mentioned with a private company, if you find you don't like that type of intrusion, you can switch providers. Police can measure the costs of their inputs because they have to buy labor and capital in the market, but they're not able to measure the value of their output because they don't make voluntary exchanges. Rather, they get their revenue through coercive means like taxation or civil asset forfeiture. And so because of this, because they also cannot engage in profit and loss calculation, they can't know the value of their output, however they decide to allocate that, whether it's to solving thefts or preventing other types of crime. So in this case, even though we like at least some of the output, presumably, that police provide, we can't measure the trade-offs because of this lack of calculation.
And then once we do have it, then deciding how to allocate it. What kind of crime should they be investigating with how many resources? Now, I can't do that right now because there's no, as you say, there's no profit and loss mechanism. But I'll tell you something. I would be willing to bet that the way they allocate resources now is extremely suboptimal, to put it mildly, that you've got police monitoring streets that are barely used to try to catch speeders, while the number of murders that go solved is shockingly low. That has to be a bad allocation of resources.
Right. When you think about it from their perspective.
From their perspective, it's not right.
They respond to incentives. There's not much revenue in solving murders where there is for catching speeders. There is for finding drug consumers who have things to confiscate. So they respond to incentives just like everyone else.
To some degree, they have to worry about reputation because individual people might wind up on the chopping block, but the whole agency is a monopoly. So whether you like them or you don't like them, they're still going to collect the tax revenue. Whereas private firms do have to worry about their reputations. And if they're responsible for using deadly force in a case where it's clearly not warranted, this is going to be a big problem for them. What would happen if capitalists do what is in their nature, namely to hire police who will just arbitrarily go around cracking the skulls of troublemakers? How do we prevent a dystopia like that?
Well, as you mentioned, reputation is a very important thing. As I mentioned, Starbucks, even in their case of a relatively minor case of really enforcing their property rights, that they have to consider what impact this will have among customers who frequent Starbucks. And if they're going to maintain those relationships, they can't just be cracking skulls arbitrarily. And a further point that's important is the legal privileges that police officers enjoy through things like their union contracts or through statute like the State Law Enforcement Officer Bills of Rights, which protects not only the police department but individuals from certain outcomes. For example, some of these collective bargaining agreements allow police, after being involved in an officer-involved shooting, to have this cooling off period for 48 hours or more in which they don't have to give a testimony. This time is ostensibly for the purpose of obtaining a lawyer, but it allows them to get their story straight. It allows them to see what's in news reports, so their testimony can be consistent with those. Whereas for the rest of us, any non-police officer, we would be interrogated right away. Some police departments must inform a police officer before they investigate him of all the evidence against him, or they may only have one interrogator at a time, precluding any good cop, bad cop routine. If a police officer has some type of disciplinary record, this will be expunged after a certain amount of time. And this can be important. If they are disciplined, either through firing or suspension, they can appeal this to an independent arbitrator. And almost every time, the arbitrator will consider their previous work history. And if any of these complaints, either sustained or unsustained against them, are not present, this can make the difference between sustaining a firing or reinstating an officer. And so, in addition to the market incentives, these legal privileges that police officers enjoy make it very hard to see why one would consider a private business more dangerous or less accountable to people than the government police are.
The average person listening to what it is that you might recommend may find it radical. Even though they may think all your complaints are justified and your insights are very significant, they still will feel like the devil I know is better than the devil I don't know. And for all its faults, the current system at least works tolerably well to the point where most of us are able to live a fairly civilized existence. So what would you say to them to make them willing to consider the possibility of a more, a radical market approach to this question that they would not consider otherwise?
Well, I think an argument that's been convincing to me is somewhat like John Hasness's The Obviousness of Anarchy, in which he points out that we enjoy all these forms of private security or private arbitration already, and we just really don't notice it. The more we don't notice it demonstrates how seamlessly it fits into our life. Whereas if you think about the fact that there's 3 to 4 times as many private police officers to every public police officer, we almost never hear about them. They're frankly out of view, whereas probably most of us have had some type of bad experience with a police officer, maybe either in the form of poor service or being unjustifiably stopped, or even worse. And so it's really kind of a Friedrich Bastiat type thing where it's what we don't see that is what makes us not realize just how well private policing can work.